Hello, today I'm asking, what is the oldest pub in London? Now, on the face of it, this seems like a really simple question, but as you'll discover today, there is not a simple answer, I'm afraid. London's buildings have changed so much over time, so what we're going to do today is run through the dozen or so contenders. I'll lay out the criteria, and you can decide, and I'll share with you what I think are the top oldest pubs in London. And, if anything, perhaps we should make a crawl of all of the pubs. It seems only fair to do the due historic diligence and visit them all. So in the description below, I've put a map of all of the pubs that I've mentioned today. So do your duty and go and visit all of these wonderful places. If you're new, my name's Katie. I'm a qualified London Blue Badge tourist guide and the founder of Look Up London, which runs public weekend walks and private tours across the capital. You can find out more about joining these tours in the link in the description. So firstly, when we're considering what is the oldest pub in London, what's the criteria? What are the factors we're considering? Well, I've come up with three things, which is 1, when were they first established? When is the earliest mention? 2, are they an actual pub and are they still going today? And 3, what about the actual building today? How much has been altered and how much is genuinely old? So let's get started. Now, given the City of London, founded by the Romans 2,000 years ago, generally has the oldest buildings in London, we have an incredibly early claim coming from the West End of London. The White Hart on Drury Lane declares itself the oldest licensed premises in London. And it has a somewhat vague claim on their website that there is a record in the Old Bailey that declares that a pub was founded on this site in 1216. However, the building itself is just about over 100 years old, rebuilt in 1912, and it's not on the same site. So I'm sorry, but it's kind of a no from me. The same goes with the City of York pub in Holborn, a wonderful place, and as the sign says, established 1430, but I'm afraid entirely rebuilt in the 1920s. But what about those founded in the 16th century? Here we have quite a few contenders. First up, we have Hampstead's Spaniards Inn, perhaps the most myth-laden pub in the list and arguably outside of London. The painted wall says established 1585. Historic England doesn't go into great detail, just saying 17th century, and Pevsner is rather more flippant, calling it merely a whitewashed 18th century pub. Zooming over to Wapping, the prospect of Whitby seems very promising, established in 1520. But again, the actual building isn't actually that old. Historic England says the oldest features are only from the 18th century. And let's not start with the Mayflower in Rotherhithe. Yes, the area is historic. Yes, the story of the Pilgrim Fathers making the journey to the New World is extraordinary. And yes, there has been a pub here since the 1550s, although not called the Mayflower. The building that we see today was completely rebuilt after the Second World War, and even before that was rebuilt in the 19th century. As Pevsner, the architectural historian, says, alas, it's only a picturesque pastiche. But staying in the 16th century, what are the other strong contenders? One is the Hoop and Grapes on Aldgate High Street. Delightfully wonky. It claims to have been built in 1593, but Historic England says that it dates probably from the late 17th century. However, the magic kind of stops at the admittedly authentic 17th century door. Inside it's been refurbished and really you don't get much of this authentic historic atmosphere. The far more wonderful looking is the Old Mitre, just off Hatton Garden down a wonderful little alleyway. Again, we have a sign proudly declaring the supposed establishment of 1546, but the building was rebuilt in 1773, and Historic England confirms that the interior was remodelled in the 1920s. Also worth mentioning here is the spotted Dog. Now this is way out of what would have been considered London at the time, but it is a genuinely old building. It's timber framed, and historic England dates part of it to the 15th century, but sadly, as it closed in 2004 and is no longer a pub, I don't think we can count it. So for my money, the most convincing here from pubs established in the 16th century has to be the George Inn in Southwark. Mentioned by John Stowe in 1598, it was wholly rebuilt after a fire in Southwark in 1676 and is the only remaining galleried coaching inn in London. The exterior is authentically 17th century, and inside, historic England lists lots of authentic 18th century features. In fact, historic England gives it grade 1 listing, the highest rank for protection, and today it's owned by the National Trust. So we march into the 17th century, and this is a key time for London, particularly in the city, because we have the Great Fire of London from 1666, which wipes away 80% of all of the City of London's buildings. But outside the city, in Covent Garden, you'll find the Lamb and Flag, claiming to be established in 1623. Now, what's interesting about this building is that although the frontage dates from the 1950s, Historic England and Pevsner agree that the building itself dates from around 1688. So we have an authentic old building and interior features, despite the frontage making it look a bit more modern. Dating from around that time in the City of London, we have the old wine shades. This, again, genuinely 17th century, but seeing as it's a wine bar rather than a pub, I don't think it can count as our contender. So for our final two contenders, we have Fleet Street's famous Ye Olde Cheshire Cheese. The overhanging lantern proudly states rebuilt 1667, just a year after the Great Fire of London. And when you go inside, it feels old. Everyone's willing it to date from the 17th century, but alas, historic England confirms that it is very much altered inside. However, some parts of it, and it is a much bigger building on the inside, are authentically old, including the vaulted cellars from the 17th century. Now, a short walk from the Old Cheshire Cheese, you have Holborn's 7 stars. We have the bold claim of established 1602, but Pevsner slaps this away, saying that plainly it cannot be earlier than the 1680s. Historic England agrees, saying that it is perhaps late 17th century. So for giving these somewhat dubious establishment dates, here we have a genuinely historic building from the 1680s, although the interior has been substantially altered in the 19th and 20th centuries. So what do we make of all of this? How do we come up with an answer and possibly define what is the oldest pub in London? For me personally, I would say that the oldest pubs have to be in genuinely 17th century buildings and have at least some authentic historic interiors. That leaves us with the 7 stars in Holborn, built probably in the 1680s. And yes, the interior has changed, but it retains that historic feel. The Old Cheshire Cheese, rebuilt 1667, and yes, perhaps the interior doesn't date quite from then, but we do have authentic 17th and 18th century features. Lastly, the George Inn in Southwark, first mentioned 16th century, and with probably the most authentic exterior and interior historic features in London. So perhaps not the most satisfying of endings, I'm afraid, but nothing is that simple when it comes to London's history. So I'd love to know, regardless of age, which is your favourite historic pub in London, and maybe you have some different criteria for measuring up what is the oldest pub in London. And even if we can't decide, let's perhaps make our way through the list I've provided on the map below. I will see you next time for more of London's hidden history.